Hadrian's Wall cuts across the spine of northern England like a scar that refuses to heal. Built between 122 and 128 AD under the orders of Emperor Hadrian, it stretches 73 miles from the Irish Sea to the North Sea, marking the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire at its zenith. The wall was never simply a barrier. It was a statement. It was a line drawn across the landscape declaring, beyond this point, civilization ends. Beyond this point, the rules change. By February 1957, the wall had stood for 18 centuries. Most of it had crumbled, reclaimed by weather and time, and the systematic pillaging of stone by locals who needed building materials more than they needed history. But sections remained, and of all the surviving fragments, none was more intact or more impressive than the stretch surrounding Housestead's fort, perched on the edge of the Windsill escarpment in the most isolated and windswept section of Northumberland. The fort itself was a ruin. Walls stood to varying heights, some reaching 15 feet, others reduced to foundation stones barely visible beneath the turf. The barracks, the granaries, the commander's quarters, the hospital, all were present in outline, their purposes readable to anyone with knowledge of Roman military architecture. But they were empty. They had been empty for 1,500 years, abandoned when the legions withdrew and left Britannia to fend for itself against the tribes that had always pressed against the wall from the north. The Cold War was in its 12th year. Britain was rebuilding, still recovering from the devastation of 2 world wars, still adjusting to its diminished role in a world now dominated by American and Soviet power. The countryside was changing. Villages that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries were being connected by new roads, electrified, brought reluctantly into the modern age. But Northumberland resisted modernization more stubbornly than most regions. The land was harsh, the weather was unforgiving, the population was sparse and accustomed to isolation. In early 1957, the British Army was conducting a series of cold weather training exercises across northern England and Scotland, preparing units for potential deployment to Norway as part of NATO contingency planning. The exercises were designated Operation Frostline, and they involved multiple infantry battalions rotating through various training areas to practice winter warfare, navigation in adverse conditions, and sustained operations in environments where temperature and terrain were as dangerous as any enemy force. One of the units assigned to Operation Frostline was the 2nd Battalion, Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, a regiment with lineage stretching back to 1,674 veterans of campaigns from the Peninsular War to Normandy. The battalion had recently returned from a 2-year posting in Germany and was being brought back to operational readiness through intensive training. The soldiers were professionals, experienced, and not given to flights of imagination. On the 4th of February 1957, C Company of the 2nd Battalion, 120 men under the command of Major Richard Ashworth, was tasked with a 4-day field exercise in the area surrounding Hadrian's Wall. The objective was straightforward: establish a defensive position along a section of the wall near Housesteads, conduct day and night patrols, practice cold weather survival techniques, and simulate response to enemy probing actions. The exercise area was remote, miles from the nearest village, accessible only by rough tracks that barely qualified as roads. The soldiers arrived by truck convoy on the afternoon of the 4th of February, disembarking at a staging area 2 miles south of the wall. They carried full field gear: Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, ammunition, rations for 4 days, winter uniforms, sleeping bags rated to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and enough fuel for portable stoves to keep from freezing during the nights. The temperature was already dropping as they marched toward their objective, the wind coming down from the north with a bite that cut through layers of wool and canvas. Major Ashworth was a veteran of the Italian campaign, 42 years old, methodical and unflappable. He had conducted dozens of field exercises in his career and approached this one with the same professional detachment he brought to all training operations. The wall was simply terrain. The cold was simply another factor to be managed. His orders were clear, his men were competent, and the exercise would proceed according to plan. But the local population had other concerns. The company's route took them through the hamlet of Barden Mill, a collection of stone cottages huddled in the valley of the South Tyne River. The residents watched the soldiers pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something darker. An elderly man standing outside the village pub called out to Ashworth as the column passed. "You'll be up at the wall then?" "That's right," Ashworth replied, not breaking stride. "In February?" "Weather's part of the training." The old man shook his head slowly. "You'll want to be careful up there, particularly after dark." Ashworth stopped. He had learned over years of service that when locals offered warnings, it was worth at least listening. "Careful of what?" "The wall's been there a long time, Major. Longer than any of us. And there's things up there that were old when the Romans built it. Things that don't take kindly to people lingering after sunset, especially in winter." The old man's accent was thick Northumbrian, the words clipped and guttural. "The Romans knew. That's why they built the wall where they did. Not just to keep the Picts out, to keep other things on the side where they belonged." "Other things," Ashworth repeated, keeping his tone neutral. "Aye, you'll see, or you'll hear. Most do if they stay long enough." The old man turned and walked back into the pub without elaborating. Ashworth filed the conversation away as local superstition and continued the march. But that evening, when the company established its defensive position along the wall near Housesteads, one of his NCOS, Sergeant William Harker, a Northumberland native, approached him with a similar warning. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Go ahead, Sergeant." "The locals around here have stories about the wall." "Old stories. My grandmother used to tell them when I was a lad. She said there were things that walked the wall at night, particularly in winter. Watchers, she called them. Roman sentries who never left their posts, even after they died. Or something older that the Romans disturbed when they dug the foundations. The stories aren't clear on which, but they all agree on one thing. If you see them, you don't approach. You don't engage. You turn around and you leave." "Ghosts, Sergeant?" Harker looked uncomfortable. "I don't know what they are, sir. But I know my grandmother wouldn't go near the wall after dark, and she wasn't a superstitious woman. And I know there have been incidents, hikers who've gone missing, shepherds who've seen things they couldn't explain. The National Trust doesn't advertise it, but they've had reports. Enough that the site wardens won't patrol alone after sunset." Ashworth considered this. He did not believe in ghosts. He had seen too much real horror during the war to credit supernatural explanations for anything. But he also knew that dismissing the concerns of his men, particularly local men, was poor leadership. "Noted, Sergeant. Pass the word to the sentries. Stay alert. Report anything unusual, no matter how trivial it seems. But we're not abandoning the exercise because of folklore." "Understood, sir." C Company dug in as the sun set. The wall at this point stood approximately 12 feet high, intact enough that it still functioned as a windbreak. The fort ruins provided some shelter, and the men established their positions within the old barrack foundations, setting up tents and arranging their equipment with the efficiency of soldiers who had done this countless times. Sentries were posted at 50-meter intervals along the wall, rotating every 2 hours. Fires were prohibited. This was tactical training, and fires would compromise camouflage. The men would rely on their sleeping bags and body heat to survive the night. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped toward 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind increased. It moved along the wall with a sound like breath through teeth, a constant keening that made conversation difficult and sleep nearly impossible. The sky was clear, stars sharp and cold above the treeless moorland. Visibility was excellent. The moon, 3 days past full, illuminated the landscape in shades of silver and black. At 21:30 hours, Private David Collins, standing sentry on the southern side of the wall, reported movement to the north. His section commander, Corporal Thomas Reed, moved to his position and observed through binoculars. The movement was distant, perhaps 400 meters beyond the wall, at the edge of visibility. It appeared to be a line of figures, moving east to west along the ridge parallel to the wall. They moved slowly in formation, maintaining spacing that suggested military discipline. Reed reported to Ashworth. "Could be locals, sir. Could be exercise observers. But they're moving in a tactical formation." "How many?" "Difficult to say in this light. At least a dozen, maybe more." Ashworth moved to the observation point and studied the figures through his own binoculars. They were there, definitely human in shape, moving with purpose. But something about them was wrong. The spacing was too perfect, the movement too synchronized, and they were walking across open moorland in sub-freezing temperatures with no visible lights, no visible equipment, nothing that would explain what they were doing or why. "Challenge them," Ashworth ordered. Reed cupped his hands and shouted across the distance, "Halt! Identify yourselves!" The figures did not halt. They did not respond. They continued moving along the ridge, maintaining their formation, and after 2 minutes they descended the far slope and disappeared from view. Ashworth lowered his binoculars. "Send a patrol. 4 men. Investigate the area where they were spotted. Report back within 30 minutes. The patrol departed at 21:45 hours. They returned at 22:23 hours, 38 minutes later than ordered. The patrol leader, Lance Corporal James Sutton, reported directly to Ashworth. His face was pale despite the cold, his hands shaking slightly as he pointed to the map. "We found tracks, sir. Multiple sets. But they don't make sense." "Explain." "They're barefoot, sir. No boots, no shoes, just footprints in the frost. And they're Roman." Ashworth stared at him. "Roman?" "Yes, sir. I grew up near Corbridge. I've seen Roman artifacts my whole life. Those footprints are from Caligay. Roman military sandals. The nails leave a distinctive pattern in the ground. I've seen it in museum displays. These tracks are fresh, sir, made within the last hour. And they're not headed anywhere. They just stop. At the edge of the ridge, they stop, like the people making them walked off into the air and disappeared." Major Richard Ashworth stood on Hadrian's wall in the freezing darkness of a February night and felt the certainty of his worldview begin to fracture. Around him, 120 soldiers prepared for a night that none of them would ever forget. And beyond the wall, in the darkness to the north, something very old had begun to take notice of the modern intruders who had come to occupy ground that had not been truly empty for 18 centuries. The Watchers had returned. Or perhaps they had never left. Major Ashworth assembled his command element in what had once been the Principia, the headquarters building of the Roman fort. The walls still stood to shoulder height, providing some shelter from the wind. He spread his map on a flat stone and gathered his platoon commanders and senior NCOs around him, their breath misting in the beam of his red-filtered torch. "Gentlemen, we have a situation that requires clarification," he began, keeping his voice level and professional. At 21:45 hours, a patrol encountered evidence of unauthorized personnel operating in our exercise area. The tracks suggest multiple individuals moving in formation. I want a full reconnaissance sweep conducted at first light. Until then, we maintained defensive posture and increased vigilance. Lieutenant Peter Davison, commander of 1st Platoon, was the first to speak. "Sir, with respect, Sutton's report mentioned Roman sandals. Is that assessment confirmed?" Lance Corporal Sutton is confident in his identification. Whether that confidence is warranted remains to be determined. That's why we're conducting a daylight reconnaissance. And if we encounter these individuals during the night, standard challenge procedure. If they fail to respond appropriately, treat them as potential hostiles, but do not engage without my direct authorization. We're in the middle of England, not a combat zone. I will not have an incident with civilians or exercise observers because someone got nervous. But even as Ashworth gave the orders, he felt the inadequacy of them. The tracks had been barefoot in sub-freezing temperatures. The formation had been too precise, too disciplined, and there was something else, something he had not mentioned to his officers yet. When the patrol had returned, all 4 men had reported the same sensation, the overwhelming feeling that they were being watched from the darkness beyond their torchlight, that something just outside their field of vision was observing them with an attention that felt almost predatory. The briefing concluded at 22:45 hours. The officers dispersed to their platoons. Ashworth remained at the Principia with his radio operator, Private Kenneth Webb, a slight young man from Manchester who had been with the battalion less than 6 months. They established communications with battalion headquarters at Otterburn, 20 miles to the north, reporting the day's activities and confirming the exercise schedule for the following day. The transmission was routine. Ashworth saw no reason to report the incident with the tracks. Not yet. Not until he had more information. The night settled into a rhythm of cold and watchfulness. Sentries changed every 2 hours, the relieved men stumbling back to their positions to crawl into sleeping bags that never quite got warm enough. The wind continued its endless movement along the wall, carrying with it sounds that might have been natural, the cry of distant sheep, the rattle of loose stones, or might have been something else entirely. At 23:40 hours, Corporal Reed reported another sighting. This time the figures were closer, perhaps 200 meters beyond the wall, moving along the same ridge as before, but heading in the opposite direction, west to east. Reed counted 15 distinct shapes. They moved in a column formation, maintaining perfect spacing, and they made no sound. No voices, no equipment rattling. Just silent movement across frozen ground. Ashworth observed them himself. Through binoculars, the figures resolved into humanoid shapes, but without clear detail. They wore something dark, cloaks or heavy clothing that obscured their forms. They carried what might have been spears or staffs, long objects held vertically at their sides. And they moved with a coordination that suggested not just training, but absolute synchronization, as if they were parts of a single organism rather than individuals. "Sir," Reed said quietly, "they're pacing us. Look at their spacing. Look at their intervals. That's exactly how a Roman patrol would have been organized along this wall. 50-meter spacing, column formation. It's textbook Roman military procedure." Ashworth could not dispute the observation. He had studied enough classical military history to recognize the pattern. The question was why? Why would anyone, reenactors, historians, pranksters, conduct a formation exercise in the middle of the night in February in the most isolated section of Northumberland? And how were they doing it barefoot without freezing to death? The column moved along the ridge for approximately 10 minutes, then descended the far slope and vanished. Ashworth ordered another patrol to investigate. This time he sent 6 men, led by Sergeant Harker, with instructions to proceed with extreme caution and report by radio every 5 minutes. The patrol departed at 23:55 hours. The first radio check came at 0000 hours, on schedule. Position reported no contact. The second check came at 0005 hours. They had reached the ridge. Multiple sets of tracks confirmed. Same pattern as before. Barefoot prints with the nail pattern of Roman caligae. The tracks were still fresh, frost disturbed within the last 15 minutes. The third check came at 0010 hours, and Sergeant Harker's voice carried an edge that had not been there before. Contact, sir. Visual on multiple figures, approximately 300 meters north of our position. They're stationary. They appear to be observing us. Can you identify them? Negative, sir. Too dark. But they're in a line. Maybe 20 of them. Just standing there, watching. Do not approach. Fall back to the wall. Acknowledge. There was a pause. Static crackled on the radio. Then Harker's voice returned, lower now, almost a whisper. Sir, they're moving. Coming toward us. Fast. Fall back now, Sergeant. Do not engage. They're not running, sir. They're walking, but they're covering ground too quickly. It's not natural. We're pulling back. The radio went silent. Ashworth called for Harker 3 times with no response. At 0014 hours, the patrol emerged from the darkness at a dead run, scrambling over the wall and taking cover behind it. All 6 men were present and accounted for, but they were breathing hard, and their expressions carried something Ashworth had seen before during the war. Not fear exactly, shock. Harker reported between gasps for breath. They followed us, sir, all the way to the wall, stayed about 50 meters back, just at the edge of visibility. When we'd stop, they'd stop. When we'd move, they'd move. Maintained perfect formation the entire time. And the sound, sir. The sound they made. What sound? Footsteps. But not on ground. It sounded like they were walking on stone, on paving, like they were marching on a Roman road. But there's no road out there, sir. Just moorland, just grass and rock. But we all heard it. The rhythmic sound of nailed sandals on stone. Ashworth moved to the wall and looked north. The figures were there. He could see them now without binoculars, standing in a line perhaps 70 meters beyond the wall, barely visible as darker shapes against the darkness of the moor. They were motionless. They made no sound. But the sense of being observed was overwhelming, a physical pressure that made the back of his neck prickle and his hands tighten on his rifle. All sentries to full alert, Ashworth ordered. No one sleeps. I want eyes on that line at all times. If they move, I want to know immediately. The figures remained motionless for 3 hours. They stood in formation as the temperature dropped and the wind increased, showing no sign of cold, no fidgeting, no human weakness. At 0317 hours, without warning, they simply vanished. One moment they were there. The next, the ground beyond the wall was empty. Multiple sentries confirmed it. The figures had not walked away. They had not retreated into the darkness. They had simply ceased to be visible, as if someone had extinguished lights that had never been lit in the first place. Ashworth stood on the wall and stared at the empty ground. His rational mind supplied explanations. Trick of the light. Optical illusion created by exhaustion and cold. Reflections of starlight on frost creating shapes the mind interpreted as human figures. But his instincts, honed by years of combat and command, told him otherwise. Something had been out there. Something had been watching. And something had demonstrated capabilities that did not fit within any framework he understood. At 0600 hours, as the first gray light of dawn began to spread across the eastern sky, Ashworth ordered a full company sweep of the area north of the wall. 3 platoons advanced in line, spacing themselves at 50-meter intervals, searching the ground systematically. They found tracks, hundreds of them. Barefoot prints with the distinctive nail pattern, crisscrossing the moorland in patterns that suggested organized movement. Some tracks simply appeared in the middle of open ground with no approach trail, as if the individuals making them had materialized from nowhere. Others terminated just as abruptly, ending in mid-stride with nothing beyond them. At 0734 hours, Private Collins made a discovery that brought Ashworth at a run. In a small depression approximately 400 meters north of the wall, Collins had found objects partially buried in the frost-hardened soil. Ashworth knelt and carefully excavated them with his knife. They were metal, corroded but identifiable. Roman military artifacts. A gladius blade, bent and pitted with age. Bronze fittings from armor. Nails from Calighi. And something else. A small lead tablet, folded and sealed, covered in text that Ashworth could not read but recognized as Latin. He wrapped the artifacts carefully in a map case and made a decision. The exercise would continue, but not here, not at House Steads. He would relocate the company to a position 5 miles west, away from the fort, away from whatever was manifesting in this particular stretch of the wall. He would complete the training requirements, submit his after-action report, and then he would turn these artifacts over to someone who could explain them. But as C Company prepared to march out at 0830 hours, breaking down their positions and loading their equipment, every man felt it. The sensation of being watched, the awareness that they were not leaving because they had completed their mission, but because they were being permitted to leave. That the things that walked this section of wall, whether ghosts or memories or something older, had assessed them and found them acceptable, or perhaps found them irrelevant. As the company marched south, away from House Steads, Sergeant Harker fell into step beside Major Ashworth. "Sir, permission to speak?" "Go ahead, Sergeant." "My grandmother was right, sir. The Watchers, they're real. Whatever those things were last night, they were Roman, or they were something pretending to be Roman, but they're not gone. They're still here. They've been here for 18 centuries, and they're not leaving." Ashworth said nothing. He did not have the words to dispute it. He had seen too much. They all had. And as they marched away from Hadrian's wall, the wind carried a sound behind them that might have been wind through ruins or might have been something else. The rhythmic sound of footsteps, of iron nails on stone, of soldiers marching along a wall that had stood for nearly 2,000 years, and would stand, Ashworth suspected, for 2,000 more. Major Ashworth submitted his after-action report on the 11th of February. The document was 23 pages, typed on a manual typewriter by his company clerk, and it contained everything that had occurred during the 4-day exercise. He did not sanitize it. He did not soften the language. He reported the sightings, the tracks, the artifacts, and the unanimous testimony of his men that they had encountered something at House Steads that defied conventional explanation. The report landed on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel James Pemberton, battalion commander, at 1400 hours that afternoon. Pemberton read it twice, then called Ashworth into his office. "Richard, I need you to tell me this is a joke." "It's not a joke, sir." "Then I need you to tell me that your men were suffering from exposure, exhaustion, or mass hallucination." "I can't tell you that either, sir." "I was there. I saw what they saw. Whatever happened at House Steads was real." Pemberton leaned back in his chair. He was 53 years old, a career officer who had commanded a company at Arnhem and survived the bridge. He had seen things during the war that still gave him nightmares. But this was different. This was England. This was peacetime. This was supposed to be routine. "The artifacts," Pemberton said. "Where are they now?" "Locked in my quarters, sir. I thought about turning them over to the base provost, but I wasn't sure of the proper procedure for archaeological finds on military training areas. Get them to the University of Durham. They have a department of archaeology. Let them authenticate the items and provide an expert assessment. I want a civilian academic opinion on record before this goes any further up the chain. Yes, sir. And Richard? Until we have that assessment, this report stays between us. I'm not sending this to brigade until I know whether we're dealing with a genuine anomaly or some kind of elaborate prank. Understood? Understood, sir. Ashworth drove to Durham the following day. The university was 50 miles south, a medieval city of stone and shadow dominated by its Norman cathedral. The Department of Archaeology occupied a Georgian building near the river, its walls lined with display cases containing pottery shards, coins, and fragments of carved stone recovered from Roman sites across northern England. Dr. Helena Marsh, senior lecturer in Romano-British Studies, received Ashworth in her office at 1100 hours. She was 46 years old, sharp-eyed and skeptical by training, a woman who had spent 20 years excavating sites along Hadrian's Wall and had little patience for amateurs who claimed to have made significant discoveries. Ashworth unwrapped the artifacts on her desk: the gladius blade, the bronze fittings, the Calighi nails, and finally, the lead tablet. Marsh's skepticism evaporated within 30 seconds. She lifted the gladius blade carefully, examining the corrosion pattern, the tang where the handle had once been attached, the faint trace of the maker's mark near the hilt. She measured it. She weighed it. She made notes. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked. Ashworth gave her the coordinates. She consulted a map on her wall, tracing the location with her finger. 400 meters north of the wall. That's unusual. Most artifacts are found at the wall itself or in the forts. Finding military equipment that far north suggests either a patrol ambush or a pursuit action. The Romans didn't venture far beyond the wall without good reason. Can you date it? Approximately. Based on the blade style and the corrosion pattern, I'd estimate mid-2nd century, possibly Hadrianic period, possibly slightly later. A proper laboratory analysis would be more precise, but this is consistent with the construction and early occupation period of the wall. She set the blade down carefully and picked up the lead tablet. This, however, is extraordinary. What is it? A curse tablet. The Romans called them defixiones. They were used to invoke divine or supernatural aid against enemies, rivals, or anyone who had wronged the person commissioning the tablet. They were common throughout the empire, but finding one in such good condition is rare. She carefully unfolded the tablet, revealing the text inscribed on the interior surface. The Latin was cramped and hurried, scratched into the soft lead with something sharp. Marsh read silently for several minutes, her expression shifting from professional interest to something darker. Finally, she looked up. "Major, do you read Latin?" "A little." "School Latin." "Nothing like this." "Then allow me to translate." She adjusted her reading glasses and began. "To the spirits of this place and to the gods below. Hear me. We who stand watch on the wall of Hadrian beseech you. The enemy beyond the wall is not only Pictish, there are older things in the darkness. Things that walked this land before Rome came. Things that resent our presence and seek our destruction. 3 centuries have vanished from their posts. Not killed, vanished. Taken by something that leaves no tracks and makes no sound. We ask for protection. We ask for deliverance. We offer this tablet and the blood of a black ram as tribute. Keep us safe through the winter. Let us see spring again. Let us leave this cursed place when our service ends." The office was silent. Ashworth felt the temperature in the room drop, though that was impossible. The radiator hissed in the corner. Traffic noise filtered in from the street outside, but the words Marsh had read seemed to hang in the air like smoke. "Is it authentic?" Ashworth asked. "It appears to be. The language is correct for the period. The style is consistent with other deficciones we've recovered. The lead is corroded in a way that suggests genuine age, not a modern forgery. But I'll need to conduct tests to be absolutely certain." She refolded the tablet carefully. "Major, may I ask why you brought these to me? Why not contact the National Trust or English Heritage? They manage the Hadrian's Wall sites." Ashworth hesitated. Then he made a decision. He told her everything. The figures on the ridge, the barefoot tracks, the sound of marching on stone where no stone existed, the sense of being watched, the objects appearing and disappearing. All of it. Marsh listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she stood and walked to her window, looking out at the cathedral that dominated the Durham skyline. "Major Ashworth, I'm a scholar. I deal in evidence, in material culture, in things that can be measured and cataloged. But I've worked on Hadrian's Wall for 2 decades, and I've heard stories from site wardens, from local farmers, from other archaeologists who won't speak about it publicly but will discuss it over drinks in private. Housesteads has a reputation. Several, in fact." "What kind of reputation?" "The fort was continuously occupied for nearly 300 years. Thousands of soldiers rotated through it. Many died there, some from disease, some from combat, some from the cold. But according to the written record, and there's more documentation for Hadrian's Wall than for most Roman frontiers, there were also inexplicable losses. Soldiers who vanished from the wall during night watch, entire patrols that failed to return from reconnaissance missions beyond the wall. The official reports attributed these losses to hostile action by the northern tribes, but some of the accounts include details that don't fit that explanation. Men who disappeared without sound, tracks that ended in impossible places, reports of figures seen marching along the wall at night in weather that should have prevented any movement." "You're saying this has happened before?" "I'm saying the phenomenon you encountered may have a long history. The Romans were practical people. They didn't abandon posts without reason. Housesteads was partially evacuated several times during the mid-2nd century, for reasons the historical record doesn't make entirely clear. Units were rotated out ahead of schedule. Garrison strength was reduced, and there are references in administrative documents to adverse spiritual conditions at certain wall forts, though what that phrase actually meant is unclear." Ashworth absorbed this. "Dr. Marsh, I need to know if what my men and I experienced was real or if there's a rational explanation I'm missing. I can authenticate the artifacts. I can provide historical context, but I can't tell you what's happening at Housesteads. No one can. However," she turned from the window to face him directly, "I can tell you that you and your men are not the first to report these phenomena, and based on the historical pattern, you won't be the last." Over the next 2 days, Marsh conducted preliminary analysis of the artifacts. The gladius was confirmed as genuine, approximately 180 AD. The bronze fittings were consistent with Lorica segmentata armor used by legionaries during the Antonine period. The caligae nails matched examples from excavated sites along the wall, and the curse tablet, subjected to spectroscopic analysis and compared against other known deficciones, was authenticated as genuine Roman manufacture, dating to sometime between 140 and 160 AD. The text of the tablet was translated more fully by a colleague specializing in provincial Latin. The expanded translation included additional details that the initial reading had missed. The 3 vanished sentries were named: Marcus Flavius, Gaius Tertius, Lucius Veranius. All members of the 20th Legion, 2nd cohort stationed at Vercovicium, the Roman name for Housesteads. The tablet specified that they had disappeared during the month of February. the coldest month, the darkest month. And the tablet included one final line that Marsh had initially overlooked, scratched smaller and fainter than the rest of the text, as if the author had been reluctant to commit it to writing. They watch from beyond the wall. They were here before us. They will be here after we are gone. Do not look at them directly. Do not answer if they call your name. Do not follow them into the darkness. On 14th February, Marsh submitted her report to Major Ashworth. It was academic in tone, cautious in its conclusions, but clear in its authentication of the artifacts. She included photographs, measurements, and comparative analysis. And she included, in an appendix, a summary of historical accounts of anomalous phenomena at housesteads, compiled from sources spanning 18 centuries. Ashworth read the report in his quarters that evening. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long time, the pages spread on his desk, the lamp casting shadows that seemed to move independent of the light. Outside, the February wind rattled the window frames. In the distance, across miles of dark moorland, Hadrian's wall stood where it had stood for nearly 2,000 years. And on that wall, Ashworth knew, the watchers were walking their eternal patrol. They had been there when the Romans built the fortifications. They had been there when the legions withdrew. They had been there through the collapse of Rome, through the Dark Ages, through the medieval period, through the Industrial Revolution, through 2 world wars. They were there now, and they would be there when the last human being had turned to dust and the wall itself had crumbled back into the earth from which it had been raised. Some boundaries, he realized, were not drawn by emperors or governments. Some boundaries were older than civilization, and some centuries never abandoned their posts, even in death. Especially in death. The question was not whether the watchers existed. The question was what they were watching for, what they were guarding against, and whether the wall they patrolled was meant to keep invaders out or something far worse contained. The return to housesteads had not been Ashworth's idea, it had been Marsh's. After authenticating the artifacts, she had become obsessed with the site, convinced that whatever phenomenon was manifesting there represented an unprecedented opportunity for research. She had petitioned Ashworth for permission to conduct a night observation, arguing that if Roman soldiers had reported similar experiences 18 centuries ago, there might be a historical continuity that could be documented and studied. Ashworth had initially refused. He had no desire to return to that stretch of wall, and he had less desire to expose a civilian academic to whatever lurked there. But Marsh was persistent. She had contacted Pemberton directly, presenting her case with the kind of rational authority that made refusal seem cowardly. And Pemberton, faced with authenticated Roman curse tablet describing the exact phenomena his men had reported, had reluctantly agreed. If the watchers were real, if they represented some kind of ongoing manifestation, then proper documentation was necessary. Better to understand it than to pretend it didn't exist. So, on the evening of the 17th of February, Ashworth found himself back at housesteads, accompanied by Marsh and Sergeant Harker. The sergeant had volunteered immediately when Ashworth had asked for someone with local knowledge and steady nerves. They arrived by Land Rover 2 hours before sunset, parking at the National Trust Visitor Center, closed for the winter, and hiking the last mile to the fort carrying equipment in military rucksacks. Marsh had brought cameras, a Rolleiflex medium format camera for still photographs, and a 16mm Bolex movie camera borrowed from the university's film department. She had brought a thermometer, a compass, a notebook, and enough pencils to document whatever they might encounter. Ashworth and Harker carried Lee Enfield rifles, loaded but with safeties engaged. Ashworth had justified the weapons as protection against wild animals. None of them believed that was what they might need them for. They established an observation post within the ruins of the Principia, the the same location where Ashworth had briefed his officers 10 days earlier. The walls provided some windbreak, and the position offered clear sight lines to the north where the watchers had appeared. Marsh set up her cameras on tripods, positioning them to cover overlapping fields of view. She checked her light meter repeatedly, calculating exposures for the available moonlight. "If they appear, I'll need at least 10 seconds of stillness to capture a clear image," she explained. "The moon is bright enough, but any movement will create blur at these exposure times." "If they appear," Harker said quietly, "I'm not sure stillness is what you'll be experiencing, Doctor." The sun set at 1727 hours. The temperature dropped rapidly. By 1900 hours, their breath was misting visibly, and frost was beginning to form on the stones around them. They waited in silence, watching the ridgeline beyond the wall where the figures had been seen. The moon rose, full and cold, casting the landscape in silver light sharp enough to read by. At 2140 hours, Marsh saw them first. She touched Ashworth's arm and pointed without speaking. They were there, on the ridge. A line of figures, perhaps 20 of them, spaced at regular intervals. They stood motionless, facing south toward the wall, and even at 200 meters, their formation was unmistakably military. Ashworth raised his binoculars. The figures were clearer than they had been during his first encounter, the moonlight rendering them in sharp detail. They wore Roman military equipment. Lorica segmentata armor was visible on some, the distinctive segmented plates catching the moonlight. Others wore mail. All carried rectangular shields, scuda, and spears. Their helmets were the Galea type, with cheek guards and neck protectors. They looked exactly like illustrations from history books, like museum reconstructions brought to life. Except they weren't alive, not in any conventional sense. The moonlight passed through them. Not completely, they were not transparent, but there was a quality to their substance that was wrong, as if they were not entirely present in the physical world. They cast no shadows. The ground beneath their feet showed no disturbance. They simply stood there, watching as they had stood for 18 centuries. Marsh was already working the cameras, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted exposures and depressed shutters. The Rolleiflex clicked softly. The Bolex whirred as film ran through its mechanism. She shot continuously for 5 minutes, documenting the figures from multiple angles. Then the figures began to move. They descended from the ridge in formation, maintaining their spacing, marching in step. And as they moved, sound reached the observation post. The rhythmic sound of footsteps, not on grass or soil, but on stone. The unmistakable cadence of hobnailed caligae striking paved surface, the sound amplified by the discipline of men marching in unison. But there was no paved surface. The ground beyond the wall was moorland, grass and heather, and exposed rock. Yet the sound was undeniable. The acoustic signature of a Roman century on the march, the sound that had echoed across half the world for 500 years as the legions conquered and held an empire. The figures reached level ground and continued toward the wall. They were 100 meters distant now, 75-50. Marsh continued filming, her academic detachment beginning to fracture as the impossible became undeniable. These were not living men. These were not reenactors. These were something else, something that wore the shape of Roman soldiers, but was fundamentally other. At 25 meters, the column halted. The figures stood in formation, shields grounded, spears held upright. They faced the wall. They faced the 3 living humans who crouched among the ruins they had once garrisoned. And for the first time, Ashworth could see their faces. They were young. Most appeared to be in their 20s, though age was difficult to determine given their translucent quality. Their expressions were blank, eyes forward, faces set in the neutral discipline of soldiers on duty. But there was something wrong with those eyes. They did not blink. They did not move. They were fixed and staring, and the moonlight that reflected from them was the wrong color, too pale, almost white. One figure stepped forward from the formation. He wore the transverse crest of a centurion, the horsehair plume that marked command authority. He was older than the others, perhaps 40, his face weathered and scarred. He carried a vitis, a centurion's swagger stick, in his right hand. He advanced to within 10 meters of the wall and stopped. Then he spoke. The voice was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakably Latin. The accent was nothing like the classical Latin Marsh had learned at university. This was provincial Latin, the rough dialect of soldiers from the frontier provinces, shaped by decades of service at the edge of the empire. But she understood enough. Quis estis? Who are you? Ashworth looked at Marsh. She was frozen, camera forgotten, staring at the centurion. He touched her shoulder gently. Doctor, can you respond? Marsh swallowed. She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible, and answered in Latin. Her voice shook. Helena Marsh Sum, studiosa, scholar. The centurion's head tilted slightly, the first individual movement he had made. Romani estis? Are you Roman? Non. Britannici sumus. Number. We are British. Britannici. The centurion seemed to consider this. Provincia Roma non est? Britain is not a Roman province? Non, non iam. Roma. She struggled for the words. Roma cessidit. Multos annos. Rome fell, many years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. The centurion stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Quanti anni? How many years? Marsh did the calculation in her head. Mille quingenti. 1500. The centurion turned his head slightly, looking back at his formation. The soldiers remained at attention, but something passed through them. A ripple of reaction too subtle to define, but unmistakable in its presence. When the centurion turned back to face Marsh, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough. There was something in those pale eyes that might have been grief, or might have been something beyond grief. The realization that everything they had fought for, everything they had died for, had ended centuries ago. Vigilamus ad hoc, he said quietly. We still watch. Quid vigilatis? Marsh asked. What do you watch for? The centurion raised his vitis and pointed north, beyond the wall, into the darkness that stretched across the moors. Quad ultra murum est, quad ante Roma venit, quad post Roma manabit. What lies beyond the wall? What came before Rome? What will remain after Rome? Quid est? What is it? The centurion lowered his stick. He looked at Marsh with those impossible eyes, and when he spoke again, his Latin was slow and deliberate, as if he wanted to ensure she understood every word. In tenebris res vivunt quae non sunt vivae, in terra res moventur quae non sunt mortales. Murum aedificavimus non modo contra pictos, sed contra antiquiora, contra timorem, contra oblivionem, et aduc vigilamus, quia murum aduc stat, et si vigilare cessamus. He paused. Si vigilare cessamus, murum non erit solum qui cadit. In the darkness things live that are not alive. In the earth things move that are not mortal. We built the wall not only against the Picts but against older things, against fear, against oblivion. And still we watch, because the wall still stands. And if we cease to watch, the wall will not be the only thing that falls. Marsh's hand found her notebook. She wrote furiously, capturing the words while they were fresh. Ashworth stood beside her, rifle lowered but ready, watching the formation that stood in the moonlight like a memory carved from shadow. The centurion stepped back. He raised his vides in salute, the formal gesture of a Roman officer acknowledging equals. Then he turned and marched back to his formation. The soldiers closed ranks around him, and as one, as if responding to an order no living ear could hear, they turned north and began marching toward the ridge. The sound of their footsteps faded gradually. They reached the ridge and ascended it, moving back into the territory beyond the wall. And as they crossed the crest and descended the far slope, they faded from view, not walking away, but simply becoming less present, less substantial, until they were nothing more than suggestions of movement in the moonlight, and then nothing at all. Marsh lowered herself to the ground and sat with her back against the stone wall. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the pencil. Harker moved to her side and offered her a flask. She took it without looking, drank, coughed, and handed it back. "Did that just happen?" she whispered. "Tell me that just happened." "It happened," Ashworth confirmed. "We all saw it. We all heard it. They're still here. After 1,500 years, they're still here. Still standing watch." "Against what?" Harker asked. What did he mean by older things? What's out there that the Romans were afraid of? Marsh looked north into the darkness beyond the wall. "I don't know, but they're still guarding against it, still holding the line, and they don't know that Rome fell. They don't know that the empire ended. They're still here, still on duty, still following orders that were given 18 centuries ago." At 03:15 hours, the temperature dropped precipitously. Within 5 minutes, it fell from 19 degrees to near zero. The wind stopped. The ambient sound of the moorland, the distant sheep, the rustle of grass, ceased entirely. And from the north came something new. Not the sound of marching, but something else. A low vibration, felt more than heard, like the growl of a massive animal or the rumble of distant thunder that never quite resolved into sound. The watchers returned, but this time they were not on the ridge. They were on the wall itself. 20 figures materialized along the fortification, spaced at intervals, facing north with shields raised and spears ready. They had taken defensive positions. They were preparing for something. And in the darkness beyond the wall, other shapes began to move. These were not Roman, these were not human. They were larger, more massive, moving low to the ground with a gait that suggested something between quadruped and biped. They left no tracks. They made no sound except that low vibration that resonated in the chest and bones. The watchers held their line. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply stood as they had stood for 18 centuries, maintaining the boundary that had been drawn across this landscape by order of an emperor who had been dust for longer than England had been a nation. At 04:45 hours, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky, both the watchers and the things they guarded against faded. The temperature normalized. Sound returned to the moorland, and 3 living humans sat among Roman ruins, trying to comprehend what they had witnessed. Marsh's cameras had captured it all. Assuming the film had survived, assuming that what they had seen could be captured on film at all. The film revealed nothing. When Marsh developed it in the university darkroom on 19th February, working alone in the chemical-smelling darkness, the negatives showed only empty moorland. The figures that had stood in formation 20 meters away, the centurion who had spoken in provincial Latin, the defensive line that had formed along the wall. None of it had registered on film. The exposures were correct. The focus was sharp. But the frames that should have contained the watchers showed only stone and grass and moonlight. The Bolex footage was identical. 16 millimeters of empty landscape, the camera panning across terrain where 24 Roman soldiers had stood in formation. Marsh watched the footage 3 times, then sat in the editing room with her head in her hands, trying to reconcile what she remembered with what the evidence showed. Ashworth's reaction was more pragmatic when she called him that evening. Does it matter? We know what we saw. All 3 of us. The cameras failing to capture it doesn't make it less real. But without evidence, it's just testimony. Anecdotal accounts that can be dismissed as hallucination or mass delusion. I have artifacts, genuine artifacts, but I can't prove they're connected to what we witnessed. The curse tablet mentions watchers, but that could be interpreted as superstition. Without photographic evidence, I have nothing that will convince anyone who wasn't there. Then we write it up anyway. Document everything. Submit it to the academic record, and let scholars 50 years from now make of it what they will. But the decision was taken out of their hands. On the 20th of February, Ashworth was summoned to London. The order came directly from the War Office, signed by a deputy secretary whose name Ashworth didn't recognize. He was to report to the Ministry of Defense headquarters in Whitehall at 0900 hours on 21st February. The subject of the meeting was not specified. Travel orders and rail warrants were attached. Ashworth arrived at Whitehall on a gray morning, the kind of London day where the sky pressed down like wet concrete and the city smelled of coal smoke and fog. He was directed to a nondescript office on the 4th floor, shown into a conference room, and told to wait. The room contained a table, 6 chairs, and a single window that looked out onto nothing but the wall of the adjacent building. At 0915 hours, 3 men entered. The first introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Thornhill, Military Intelligence. The second was Dr. Edmund Graves, identified only as representing Her Majesty's government. The third did not introduce himself at all. He simply took a seat at the far end of the table and opened a briefcase. Thornhill spoke first. Major Ashworth, we've read your after-action report. We've read Dr. Marsh's preliminary assessment of the artifacts, and we've had a very interesting conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Pemberton about the events at Housesteads. Yes, sir. We need you to understand something. What you encountered at Hadrian's Wall is not unprecedented. It's not even particularly unusual. It's simply not widely known. Ashworth felt the ground shift beneath him. Sir? Dr. Graves leaned forward. Major, Britain has a long history, a very long history, and in that history there are discontinuities, places where the normal rules don't quite apply, places where things persist that shouldn't persist. Hadrian's Wall is one such place. There are others. Stonehenge exhibits certain anomalies during the winter solstice. The Tower of London has phenomena that date back to the Norman period. There's a stretch of the Thames near Richmond where medieval structures appear and disappear according to a cycle we haven't fully determined. These places exist, they're documented, and they're managed. Managed, Ashworth repeated. By whom? The unnamed man at the end of the table spoke for the first time. His voice was cultured, Oxford-educated, completely devoid of warmth. By us, Major. By organizations that have existed, in various forms, since at least the Tudor period. We monitor sites of historical anomaly. We study them when possible. We contain them when necessary. And we ensure that public awareness remains minimal. Why? Because the alternative is panic. Because if people understood what persists in certain locations, the psychological impact would be devastating. And because some of these phenomena are not passive, they can be triggered, they can escalate, and in worst-case scenarios, they can spread. Thornhill opened a folder. Housesteads has been monitored since 1923, when a team of archaeologists from Newcastle University reported similar sightings to what you experienced. Before that, there are documented accounts going back to the medieval period. The Romans themselves reported the phenomena. Your discovered curse tablet is one of several that have been found in the area. The Watchers have been seen consistently for at least 1,800 years, and possibly longer. What are they? Ashworth asked. Are they ghosts? Residual energy? Something else? We don't know, Graves admitted. The prevailing theory is that there's some form of psychic impression. A historical event or series of events so traumatic, so significant, that it left a permanent mark on the location. The soldiers who manned the wall believed they were guarding against something. That belief was powerful enough, sustained enough, that it created a kind of echo. And that echo has persisted. But I spoke with them. Dr. Marsh spoke with the centurion. That's not just an echo. No, the unnamed man agreed. It's not. Which is why Housesteads is classified as a Category 3 site. The phenomena there demonstrate awareness, interaction capability, and purposeful behavior. They're not simply repeating a pattern, they're responding to stimuli, which makes them significantly more complex and significantly more dangerous than residual hauntings. Dangerous how? Thornhill closed his folder. Major, did Dr. Marsh tell you what the centurion said? About what lies beyond the wall? He said they were guarding against something older than Rome, something that came before and will remain after. Yes, and that's the concerning part. Because we have evidence, fragmentary, difficult to interpret, but evidence nonetheless, that the Watchers are not the only phenomenon at Hadrian's Wall. There's something else out there, something they're still guarding against. And on the occasions when the Watchers have failed to appear during documented observation periods, other things have manifested, things that are decidedly hostile. The unnamed man extracted a file from his briefcase. December 1938. A hiking party of 4 individuals camped near Housesteads during the winter solstice. The weather turned severe, forcing them to shelter in the fort ruins overnight. They reported being attacked by what they described as shapes in the darkness. 2 members of the party were killed. The other 2 survived, but were found in a state of extreme psychological trauma. They died within 3 months, one by suicide, the other from a stroke attributed to sustained stress. The inquest was inconclusive. The file was buried. March 1947, a pair of National Trust site wardens conducting a dawn survey encountered something near the northern section of the wall. They described it as massive, low to the ground, moving wrong. Both men ran. One made it back to the road. The other was found 2 days later, dead from exposure, 3 miles from where he should have been. His compass was spinning, his watch had stopped, and he had written one phrase in his notebook over and over: "The wall must stand." The pattern is consistent. When the Watchers are present, nothing else manifests. When the Watchers are absent, other phenomena appear. And those phenomena are not benign. Whatever the Romans were guarding against, it's still there, still beyond the wall, still waiting. Ashworth absorbed this. "What do you want from me?" "Silence first and foremost," Thornhill said. "Your report will be reclassified top secret. You will not discuss what you experienced at Housesteads with anyone outside this room without explicit authorization. Dr. Marsh will receive the same instructions. Sergeant Harker has already been briefed and has agreed to the terms." "And second?" "Second, we need you to return. One more time, with proper equipment, with observers who understand what they're looking for. We need to document the phenomena more thoroughly. We need to understand why it's persisting. And we need to determine whether the watchers are weakening. Weakening? Dr. Graves nodded. Historical accounts suggest the watchers appeared nightly during the medieval period. By the 19th century, sightings had decreased to several times per month. Current data suggests they manifest perhaps once or twice per month, primarily during the winter. If that decline continues, if the watchers eventually cease to appear, we need to know what will happen. What will fill the vacuum they leave behind? And if we don't like what we find? The unnamed man smiled without humor. Then, Major, we will have to consider more aggressive containment measures, which is why we'd prefer to understand the situation thoroughly before making any decisions. This is your expertise now, whether you wanted it or not. The meeting concluded at 10:45 hours. Ashworth was given a security clearance upgrade, a new set of orders, and a train ticket back to Northumberland. He was also given a telephone number, a London exchange, no name attached, to call if the situation at Housesteads escalated beyond his ability to manage. On the 23rd of February, Ashworth met with Dr. Marsh in Durham. He told her everything. She listened in silence, her academic skepticism finally and completely eroded by the weight of official confirmation. What they had witnessed was real. It was known, and it was part of something much larger and much stranger than either of them had imagined. "They want us to go back," Ashworth said. "When?" "Next month, during the spring equinox. They believe the phenomena may be stronger during celestial events. They want to observe under controlled conditions." Marsh looked out her office window at the cathedral that had stood for 900 years, a monument to faith and permanence. "Major, what if the Watchers are right? What if there is something out there? Something that predates Rome, predates Britain, predates everything we understand about this island? What if the wall really is the only thing holding it back?" "Then we need to know," Ashworth said, "because walls don't last forever. They crumble, they fall. And when they do, whatever they were built to contain doesn't simply vanish, it's released." He didn't say what they were both thinking, that Hadrian's wall had stood for 1800 years, that it had been crumbling for most of that time, that large sections had already collapsed, reclaimed by time and weather and human intervention, and that if the Watchers were tied to the wall, if their persistence depended on the physical structure they had once garrisoned, then their inevitable decline was not a mystery to be solved, but a countdown to be monitored. The question was not whether the Watchers would eventually fade. The question was what would happen when they did. What would emerge from the darkness beyond the wall when the sentries who had held that line for 2 millennia finally abandoned their posts, and whether anyone would be prepared for the answer. The spring equinox observation was planned with military precision. Major Ashworth returned to Housesteads on the 20th of March with a team of 8 personnel: Dr. Marsh, Sergeant Harker, 2 technicians from the Ministry of Defense Special Projects Division, and 3 additional soldiers selected for their experience and discretion. They brought equipment that went far beyond cameras: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared sensors, sound recording apparatus, and instruments whose purpose Ashworth didn't fully understand but had been assured were necessary. The team established their position within the Principia as before, but this time they erected a canvas shelter to protect the equipment from the elements. The weather was milder than it had been in February, temperatures hovering in the low 40s, but the wind remained constant, moving along the wall with that same breathing quality that made conversations difficult and nerves raw. The equinox occurred at 1743 hours GMT. The sun set at 1812 hours. And as darkness fell across the moorland, the team activated their instruments and waited. The electromagnetic sensors registered normal background levels. The infrared detected only the residual heat of the stones, slowly radiating the day's warmth into the cooling air. For 2 hours, nothing happened. At 20:34 hours, every instrument simultaneously registered a spike. The electromagnetic field detector climbed from 0.3 milligauss to over 40 milligauss in less than 10 seconds. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 minutes, and the sound recording equipment picked up something that made the technicians exchange worried glances. A low-frequency vibration at approximately 19 hertz, right at the threshold of human hearing, the frequency known to induce feelings of unease and fear. The watchers appeared at 20:04 1 hours. They materialized on the wall itself this time, not approaching from the ridge but simply becoming visible where they had not been visible moments before. The formation was larger than previous sightings. Ashworth counted 37 distinct figures. They faced north, shields raised, spears ready. The centurion was present, his transverse crest identifying him immediately. Dr. Marsh approached the wall slowly, hands visible and empty. She spoke in Latin, greeting the centurion by rank, requesting permission to observe. The centurion turned his head to regard her. For a long moment he was silent. Then he responded, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. Vos iterum venistis. You have come again. Yes. To understand. To learn. To help if we can. Adiuvare non potestis. You cannot help. Why not? The centurion gestured north with his vitis. Quia quod ultramurum est crescit, fortius fit, et nos. He paused, and for the first time, his voice carried something that might have been weariness. Et no debiliores fimus, pauciores. Tempus nos consumit, sicut consumit murum. Because what lies beyond the wall grows stronger, and we grow weaker, fewer. Time consumes us as it consumes the wall. Marsh wrote frantically in her notebook. What will happen when you can no longer watch? The centurion did not answer immediately. He looked along the line of soldiers standing with him, figures that were becoming increasingly translucent, increasingly tenuous. When he spoke again, his Latin was slow and deliberate. Quod semper est accidendum, finis custodum, finis muri, finis limitis inter mundum vestrum et alterum. What must always happen? The end of the watchers. The end of the wall. The end of the boundary between your world and the other. Can the boundary be maintained? Can it be rebuilt? Non ferro, non lapide, not with iron, not with stone. The centurion turned to face Marsh fully. Limes in mentibus aedificatus est, in memoria, in timore, in fide quod custodia necessaria est. Si fide sperit, lim sperit, et quod trans limitem est. He did not finish the sentence. The boundary was built in minds, in memory, in fear, in the belief that the watch is necessary. If the belief perishes, the boundary perishes. And what lies beyond the boundary? At 21:17 hours, the temperature dropped again, this time precipitously. Within 3 minutes, it fell to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind stopped entirely, and from the north came the sound that had been recorded during the February observation. That low vibration, but stronger now, sustained, resonating in the chest and bones of every person present. The watchers tightened their formation. They moved into a defensive posture, shields overlapping, spears leveled. And in the darkness beyond the wall, shapes began to move. Marsh trained the infrared sensor in that direction. The display showed massive thermal signatures, far larger than human, moving with a gait that the computer struggled to analyze. Whatever was out there was warm-blooded, or gave off heat in ways that mimicked warm-blooded organisms. But the shapes were wrong. The proportions didn't match any known animal. One of the MOD technicians, a man named Fletcher who had maintained professional detachment throughout the observation, went pale as he watched his instruments. "Sir, the EM readings are off the scale. Whatever's out there is generating a field that's interfering with our equipment. I'm getting readings that don't make physical sense." Ashworth moved to his position. The electromagnetic detector was cycling through values that climbed into the hundreds of milligauss, dropped to 0, spiked again. "Equipment malfunction?" "No, sir. The equipment's functioning normally. It's what it's detecting that's abnormal. It's like the space out there isn't stable, like the normal physics don't apply." On the wall, the watchers held their line. The shapes in the darkness moved closer, circling the perimeter at a distance of perhaps 100 meters. They never fully emerged into visibility, remaining at the edge of perception, suggestions of mass and movement rather than distinct forms. But their presence was undeniable. The air itself felt wrong, pressed and twisted, as if reality were being strained by something trying to force its way through from somewhere else. The confrontation lasted 18 minutes. The watchers did not advance. The shapes did not retreat. They maintained their positions, locked in a stalemate that had apparently been ongoing for centuries. And then, as the moon reached its zenith, the shapes withdrew. They moved back into the darkness beyond the 100-meter perimeter, fading from the infrared sensors, their thermal signatures diminishing until they were indistinguishable from the ambient temperature of the moorland. The watchers remained in position for another hour. Then, at 23:41 hours, the Centurion raised his vites in salute, the same gesture he had made during the February encounter, and the formation dissolved. The figures faded, becoming transparent, then translucent, then simply absent. The wall was empty again. The temperature began to rise. The electromagnetic readings normalized. Dr. Marsh stood at the wall, staring north into darkness that now appeared ordinary, but felt anything but. "They're failing," she said quietly. "Did you see?" Some of them were barely visible. Some were more transparent than others. "They're fading, and they know it." The team packed their equipment in silence and departed Housesteads at 02:30 hours. They drove back to Durham without speaking, each processing what they had witnessed. The instruments had captured data, but whether that data would mean anything to anyone who hadn't been present was uncertain. On the 24th of March, Ashworth submitted his second report to the War Office. It was 47 pages, supplemented by instrument readings, photographs of the equipment displays, and Dr. Marsh's detailed linguistic analysis of the Centurion's statements. The report concluded with a recommendation that Housesteads be designated a permanent restricted area, and that regular monitoring be established to track the decline of the watchers and the corresponding increase in activity from the phenomena they opposed. The recommendation was accepted. On 28 March 1957, the Ministry of Defense quietly purchased the land surrounding Housesteads Fort from the National Trust, citing defense research requirements. Civilian access was not prohibited. That would have raised too many questions. But the site was placed under discreet surveillance. Motion sensors were installed, remote cameras were positioned, and a small team of observers, operating under the cover of archaeological research, established a permanent presence at the site. Major Ashworth was reassigned to the Special Projects Division, his transfer effective 1 April 1957. His duties were described in official documents as historical site analysis and threat assessment, which was accurate enough if one understood what threat meant in this context. He would spend the next decade monitoring sites across Britain where historical phenomena persisted, where the past refused to remain past, where boundaries drawn centuries ago still held but were weakening year by year. Dr. Marsh continued her academic work, But her research focus shifted. She published papers on Romano-British belief systems, on the psychology of frontier garrisons, on the persistence of folk traditions in areas of prolonged occupation. She never directly mentioned the Watchers, but her colleagues noted a change in her approach. She had become interested in what she called liminal spaces, boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between order and chaos, between the known world and whatever lay beyond it. Sergeant Harker returned to his unit, but requested a transfer within 6 months. He could not articulate why, but being in Northumberland had become unbearable. He felt watched constantly. He dreamed of the centurion's face, of those pale eyes that had seen Rome fall and Britain rise and had continued watching through it all. He was granted compassionate reassignment to a posting in Germany, where the borders were political rather than metaphysical, and the things that lurked in the darkness were at least corporeal. The 3 missing soldiers from the original C Company observation, Sawyer, Hutchins, and Vega, were never found. Their files were marked, missing presumed dead, and stored in a restricted archive that few people had access to and fewer still understood the significance of. But in the classified addendum to Ashworth's report, there was a note that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It is possible that the 3 missing personnel from the February observation were not taken by the Watchers, but by what the Watchers guard against. If so, their fate serves as clear evidence of what will be unleashed when the Watchers finally fail. The Romans knew what lay beyond the wall. They built their fortifications to contain it. They died maintaining that containment. And their shades continue the work 18 centuries later, growing weaker with each passing year, holding a line that fewer and fewer people believe needs to be held. When that line breaks, and it will break, we will discover very quickly whether the Romans' fear was justified. By then, it will be too late to rebuild what we have allowed to crumble through neglect and disbelief. The observation post at Housesteads remained operational, manned in rotating shifts, monitoring equipment recording data that accumulated in filing cabinets and basements in London. The Watchers continued to appear, though less frequently, their numbers declining, their presence becoming more tenuous with each manifestation. And in the darkness beyond the wall, something very old and very patient continued to wait, testing the boundary, probing for weaknesses, growing stronger as the sentries who opposed it grew weaker. The Romans had understood. They had built their wall and manned it with legions and accepted that some positions required eternal vigilance. Modern Britain had forgotten that lesson. But at Housesteads, at the edge of the moorland where the wind never quite stopped and the stones remembered empire, a handful of people now understood what the Romans had known. Some boundaries must be maintained. Some Watchers must never be relieved. And some walls, no matter how ancient or ruined, must never be allowed to fall completely, because what they contain is worse than what they exclude. And what they exclude has been waiting, patient and terrible, for the moment when the last sentry fades and the wall stands undefended. That moment was coming, not today, not this year, but coming nonetheless, as inevitable as time itself. The Housesteads observation program continued for 67 years, operating under various cover designations and bureaucratic umbrellas, surviving changes in government, shifts in defense priorities, and periodic budget reviews that questioned the value of maintaining surveillance on a Roman ruin in Northumberland. The program persisted because a small number of people in positions of authority understood what was at stake and ensured that the monitoring never ceased, even when the justifications for it became increasingly difficult to articulate in official documents. Major Richard Ashworth retired from active service in 1967 with the rank of colonel, having spent his final decade in uniform overseeing what had grown into a network of observation sites across Britain. Housesteads remained the priority location, but other sites had been added as evidence accumulated of similar phenomena elsewhere. A section of Offa's Dyke in Wales showed seasonal manifestations. The Roman walls of York occasionally displayed phantom legionaries during winter solstice. A stretch of the Antonine Wall in Scotland, Rome's brief and failed attempt to extend the frontier north of Hadrian's barrier, exhibited phenomena that matched the housestead's pattern but were weaker, less consistent, as if the shorter period of occupation had left a less permanent impression. Ashworth kept detailed journals throughout his tenure with the Special Projects Division. These journals, classified upon his death in 1982, documented a slow and steady decline in the Watchers' manifestations. In 1957, they had appeared an average of 4 times per month during winter, twice per month during summer. By 1965, the frequency had dropped to once or twice per month, regardless of season. By 1975, sightings occurred perhaps 6 times per year. The pattern was unmistakable. The Watchers were fading, consumed by the same erosion of time that was reducing their wall to scattered ruins. Dr. Helena Marsh published her final paper in 1989, a comprehensive study titled Persistent Phenomena and the Archaeology of Belief, Hadrian's Wall as Case Study in Historical Memory. The paper was dense, academic, carefully worded to avoid explicit supernatural claims, while nonetheless documenting patterns that defied conventional explanation. She cited historical accounts spanning 15 centuries, all describing similar phenomena at the same locations. She analyzed the psychological impact of prolonged military occupation on landscape and memory, and she concluded with a statement that her academic peers found provocative but could not definitively refute. There is evidence to suggest that certain locations subjected to sustained human presence, particularly presence characterized by fear, violence, or intense purpose, develop what might be termed a historical resonance. This resonance manifests as recurring perceptual phenomena reported by observers across centuries, suggesting not merely cultural transmission of folklore, but genuine persistence of some kind of impression or recording in the physical environment itself. Whether this represents consciousness, energy, or some aspect of reality we do not yet understand, the consistency of the accounts demands serious investigation rather than dismissal. The paper generated controversy, but little funding for further research. Marsh died in 1994, having spent her final years compiling an archive of accounts from Hadrian's Wall that was deposited with the University of Durham Library under a 50-year seal. That archive, scheduled to be opened in 2044, contains interview transcripts, instrument readings, and classified documents that Marsh somehow obtained access to during her decades studying the site. What it reveals will depend on whether anyone in 2044 cares enough to read it. The Watchers' decline accelerated in the 1990s. Manifestations became rare, occurring perhaps twice per year, and when they did appear, the figures were barely visible, translucent to the point of near transparency. The Centurion appeared for the last documented time on the 9th of February 1997, 40 years to the day after Ashworth's original encounter. The observation team on duty that night reported a single figure standing on the wall at the location where the Principia had once stood. He was alone. No formation surrounded him. He stood for approximately 10 minutes facing north, then raised his vites in salute and faded from view. He was never seen again. Not by the official observers, not by the remote cameras, not by the motion sensors that had been upgraded repeatedly over the decades. The Centurion who had commanded the Watchers for 18 centuries had finally abandoned his post, his duty fulfilled or his strength exhausted, the distinction unclear. But other phenomena continued. The shapes beyond the wall, the things the Watchers had opposed, were detected with increasing frequency. The infrared sensors registered thermal signatures moving across the moorland north of Housesteads. The electromagnetic detectors recorded field fluctuations that followed no predictable pattern, and hikers occasionally reported experiences that matched historical accounts: feelings of being followed, sounds of movement in darkness, the sensation of something massive passing just beyond visual range. The Ministry of Defense responded by quietly expanding the restricted area, citing archaeological sensitivity and habitat protection. Access to certain sections of the wall was informally discouraged through strategic placement of warning signs about dangerous terrain and nesting birds. The observation post at Housesteads was maintained but reduced in staffing, operating primarily on automated systems monitored remotely from a facility near Newcastle. In 2004, following a Freedom of Information Act request from a journalist researching Cold War military activities, a heavily redacted version of Ashworth's 1957 reports was released. The documents confirmed that military personnel had reported unusual phenomena at Hadrian's Wall during training exercises, that these reports had been investigated, and that ongoing monitoring had been established. The specific nature of the phenomena was redacted. The names of personnel involved were redacted, but enough information was released to generate interest. Amateur researchers began frequenting Housesteads, particularly during winter months when the original sightings had been most frequent. Some claimed to see figures on the wall. Others reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained cold spots, the sensation of being watched. Most experienced nothing and concluded the accounts were exaggerated or fabricated. But a small percentage encountered something genuine, something that sent them home with changed perspectives and reluctance to discuss what they had experienced. The academic community remained divided. Skeptics attributed all accounts to suggestion, misperception, and the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. Believers argued that the consistency of reports across centuries indicated genuine phenomena requiring investigation. Both sides published papers. Neither convinced the other. The debate generated more heat than light and eventually faded from active discussion as newer controversies emerged. But among a small community of researchers, historians, and former military personnel who had served with the observation program, a quiet certainty persisted. The watchers had been real. They had maintained a boundary for 18 centuries, and that boundary was now undefended, the sentries who had held it finally exhausted, the wall they had garrisoned reduced to ruins that tourists photographed without understanding what they represented. In 2019, a severe winter storm struck Northumberland, the kind of weather event that occurred perhaps once per century. Winds exceeded 80 miles per hour. Temperature dropped to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. And a 50-meter section of Hadrian's Wall near Housesteads, which had stood since 128 AD, finally collapsed. The stones, already weakened by 18 centuries of weathering, could not withstand the combined assault of wind and ice. They fell, tumbling down the escarpment, scattering across the moorland they had once divided. The National Trust issued a press release expressing regret and committing to assessment and potential restoration. English Heritage convened a panel of experts to discuss preservation strategies. Archaeological societies debated whether the collapsed section should be rebuilt or left as a monument to time's victory over human ambition. But in a basement office in Newcastle, an observer monitoring the automated systems at Housesteads noted something unusual. In the week following the collapse, the electromagnetic sensors registered activity levels higher than any recorded since the program began. The infrared cameras captured thermal signatures crossing the line where the wall had stood, moving south into territory they had previously remained beyond. And motion detectors positioned along the moorland recorded movement patterns that suggested multiple large entities traveling in coordinated patterns. The reports were forwarded up the chain of command. They were reviewed, analyzed, and filed. No action was taken. What action could be taken? The wall had fallen, the watchers were gone, and whatever they had been holding back was now testing boundaries that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. In 2024, 3 hikers disappeared near Housesteads during a February night hike. They were experienced, equipped with GPS devices and communication equipment familiar with the terrain. They simply failed to arrive at their intended destination. Search and rescue teams found their campsite undisturbed, their equipment present, but no trace of the hikers themselves. The search was suspended after 2 weeks. The case remained open but inactive, filed under missing persons cause unknown. Those familiar with the history recognized the pattern. It was the same pattern that had appeared in Roman records, the same pattern that had been documented in medieval accounts, the same pattern that had claimed soldiers from C Company in 1957. Disappearances without explanation, without trace, without resolution. The wall no longer stood, the watchers no longer walked, and what had been contained for 2 millennia was no longer contained. It was patient, it was careful. It took only occasionally, only enough to feed without drawing too much attention. But it was there, beyond where the wall had been, in the darkness that had always been there, and always would be. Sergeant William Harker, who had served with Ashworth during the original observation, died in 2021 at the age of 89. In his will, he left a sealed letter to be delivered to the Ministry of Defense. The letter was briefed to whom it may concern. I was there in 1957. I saw the watchers. I spoke with the centurion. And I understood what he was telling us. The wall wasn't built to keep the Picts out. It was built to keep something else contained. The Romans knew. They tried to warn us, but we didn't listen. We let the wall crumble. We dismissed the watchers as superstition. And now we will learn what the Romans understood. Some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend politics and empire. Some walls must never fall. We failed to maintain what they built. We will pay the price for that failure. I only hope it comes slowly enough that someone, somewhere, learns from our mistake before it's too late. The letter was filed. It was not circulated. The few who read it recognized the truth in it, but lacked the authority or resources to act on that recognition. Hadrian's Wall remains, most of it. Tourists walk its length during summer, taking photographs, marveling at Roman engineering, imagining legionaries marching along its battlements 2,000 years ago. They do not know that some of those legionaries never left. They do not understand what the wall was truly built to contain. And they do not realize that the barrier between their world and something older, something patient, something terrible, is crumbling, stone by stone, year by year. At housesteads, on cold February nights, when the wind moves along the wall with that breathing quality that makes conversation difficult, some visitors still report seeing figures. Soldiers in Roman armor, standing watch, fading in and out of visibility like reception on a distant radio station. These reports are dismissed as imagination, trick of moonlight, the human tendency to see what we expect to see. But occasionally, someone who knows the history will stand at housesteads after dark and understand what they're witnessing. The last remnants of a garrison that never surrendered, never retreated, never abandoned their duty, even after empire fell and centuries passed. They're still there, barely, fighting a holding action against time itself, against their own erosion, against the inevitability of their final dissolution. And when they're gone, truly gone, with no strength left to manifest even as fading shadows, the boundary they maintained will exist only in memory. The wall will stand as ruins. And what the Romans understood, what they fought and died to contain, will be free to cross into a world that has forgotten why the wall was built and no longer believes that anything lurks beyond it. The watchers on Hadrian's Wall are failing. The wall itself is falling. And the darkness beyond, which has waited with infinite patience for this moment, continues to wait just a little longer. Not much longer, but long enough.